Hey, what's up, everybody? Sorry for the wait. You know how it goes over here. And as I always say, we need our like Jimmy Dore like interlude or intro. And someday I'll get around to doing that. Maybe when this war is over. Maybe if this war doesn't expand and just leave the region and the rest of us in ashes. But that does appear to be sort of where it's going, and we're going to talk about that today. Anyway, I'm here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate. How's it going, Aaron?
How's it going, Max? Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you're watching us live, please like the stream. And yeah, a good rule of thumb for a Grayzone live stream is if you're trying to watch us live, if you see the start time, whatever it is, just add 5 or 10 minutes and you'll catch us on time.
Yeah, I tried to add 5 or 10 minutes to when I would have started, but then it just, yeah. Everyone around me, like my family or anyone who ever lived with me, would always lie to me about time too. They'd always go like at 7:30, and it'd always be 7.
Yeah, smart. That's smart.
That's I think more intelligent people tend to be late.
Hey, I concur with that. I'm late all the time, so I endorse that for sure.
And look how stupid Germany is right now. I mean, look at their leadership. So what week are we on of the Gaza Holocaust? I've lost track. It's like 2.5 months of a actual Holocaust. And we always thought, if the pictures had just gotten to the American public sooner, the U.S. would have bombed the tracks to the concentration camps. And, if only Americans had known about the Trail of Tears and the Sand Creek Massacre and everything being carried out in their name for Western expansion, they might have actually done something. No, these pictures have never been more available. The video has never been more available. We're seeing a Holocaust in real time, literally what might actually be the most brutal war since World War I in terms of mass killing for the population per day, including the killing of children, an industrial slaughter of children, something like 75 children killed per day by Israel. And the United States is a direct party to this, a Democratic administration that preaches the gospel of diversity, equity, and inclusion is directly involved in this genocide. They know exactly what's going on. They know exactly what they're doing. And they're here to say, this is who we are. And today at the United Nations, the United States made that more abundantly clear. Aaron, I don't know, did you follow the UN vote?
I followed the lead up to the UN vote where the U.S. kept blocking even the most tepid language because they couldn't countenance a call for a ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian aid, which are both the opposite of U.S.-Israeli policy. And so finally, after successfully neutering the resolution to make it meaningless, the U.S. allowed itself to abstain. And just before we keep on with the UN vote, on your point about this being the deadliest since World War I, and that's because this is not a war. This is a massacre with one of the most densely, if not the most densely populated area in the world, just being bombarded by one of the world's most powerful armies. Yeah, on the ground, there is some fighting, but Hamas doesn't have air power, it doesn't have air defenses. It doesn't have any of the standard basics you need to defend yourself against a invasion. And accordingly, we're seeing an unprecedented death toll. The official toll is over 20,000, but that's an undercount because people are buried under the rubble, and the hospitals have been deliberately attacked by Israel, including Gaza's biggest hospital, Al-Shifa, which we're going to talk about because the lies to sustain that attack have been newly exposed by the Washington Post of all places. Of course, well after the damage was done. Israel's dropping 2,000 bombs. A recent U.S. intelligence assessment found that nearly half of the Israeli bombs that are being dropped are so-called dumb bombs, which have a blast range of up to 1,000 feet and are just completely indiscriminate. And that's why Biden blurted out that Israel is carrying out indiscriminate bombing. So he knows Israel is carrying out indiscriminate bombing. He doesn't care. He continues to arm it and block any efforts to stop it.
Yeah, I remember finding dumb bombs scattered all over the outskirts of the city of Rafah in southern Gaza after Black Friday, when Israel killed over 100 civilians in like an hour. They were, I think, General Dynamics dumb bombs. They had all the markings made in the USA on them. The U.S. is also, the State Department has also authorized 16,000 tank shells to Israel without congressional approval. It fast-tracked the tank shells. There's less transparency around these weapons shipments than there are to Israel than there are to Ukraine. And, just going back to the UN resolution, the US basically wrote the resolution in a watered down fashion, then kept criticizing it so it could be watered down even further. And then they thanked everyone for their humanitarian efforts. And the whole point of this resolution, at least they brought out the ambassador this time, Linda Thomas Greenfield, to vote for it. She was too ashamed to show up to vote to veto a real ceasefire resolution. The whole point of this resolution was to not have a ceasefire because the language was so watered down that it provides more diplomatic cover for Israel to continue this historically unprecedented slaughter of civilians. And that means that the U.S. sees as its main role providing diplomatic cover and logistical and munition support for the genocide of our times, for the Holocaust of our times. We are living through and witnessing a Holocaust, and the U.S. is directly involved.
They're directly involved. They've admitted that, contrary to U.S. law, they're not doing any assessments to see whether Israel's complying with U.S. law, which says we can't give weapons to countries that are violating human rights. So the U.S. is deliberately not conducting any assessments to judge whether Israel is complying with that because they know the answer already. So even though they provide the weaponry, even though they know exactly what Israel is doing, they're not taking the basic step of checking whether or not Israel is in compliance with human rights law, because they know once they do the most minimum check, they wouldn't be allowed to send these weapons to Israel. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, so here's the Associated Press throwing lots of ads in here. The Associated Press has a piece on how Israel's war is one of the most destructive in history. How does the destruction stack up historically? By some measures, destruction in Gaza has outpaced Allied bombings of Germany during World War II. And of course, we've heard Israeli officials, from Israel's ambassador to the UK to former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, the ambassador to UK, Sipi Hotoveli, declaring that Israel is reenacting Dresden, that the Allied bombing of Dresden is its model for Gaza, because of course the Palestinians are Nazis. Between 1942 and 1945, the Allies attacked 51 major German cities, destroyed about 50% of the urban areas, according to Robert Pape, who's a U.S. military historian, produced a landmark and I would say kind of path-breaking study on suicide bombings and why people do it. And he said this was about 10% of the buildings across Germany, 33%, compared to 33% across Gaza. So the amount of infrastructure that's been destroyed in Gaza is 3 times more than the Allies destroyed in Nazi Germany.
And we're talking about over such a shorter amount of time too. We're talking about less than 3 months. That period there was what, 3 years?
3 years versus less than 5.
Yeah. It's just unfathomable. It's unfathomable.
In Gaza now sits comfortably in the top quartile of the most devastating bombing campaigns ever. I would say it is the top most devastating bombing ever, also because of the kind of munitions available to Israel. As you mentioned, Aaron, they're using these 500-pound, 200-pound dumb bombs where they dive bomb them, but they're also using Hellfire missiles, and they're using 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, which kill everything, guaranteed within a 100-meter radius, and have killed hundreds in 1 or 2 strikes in some of the most densely populated area on the planet, Jabalia refugee camp. Let's take a look at some of the bombing 2 days ago. This was around the Kuwaiti hospital, which I visited in Rafah. and where bodies are always being treated on the floor. Bodies are piling up. We actually have a piece at the Grayzone where you can watch exclusive footage that we got from inside Kuwaiti hospital of child casualties coming in.
Just
if you can
insane.
stomach that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And this is what it looked like. Sorry. Kind of lost something here. That's all around the hospital. It's just what they did to Shifa Hospital as well when they started bombing around the hospital to terrorize people, because so many people are taking shelter there and see it as a safe place. Israel also wants to manufacture a humanitarian crisis by putting all of these hospitals out of business. And the head doctor there, Suhaib Al-Homs, who I interviewed, his entire family was killed while he was working in a targeted strike on his home. Doctors are being targeted across the Gaza Strip. The person who's considered the finest physician in Gaza, who is the head of the emergency department at Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, was killed. He was a friend of Dr. Mads Gilbert, who paid tribute to him here. And I mean, this goes hand in hand with the killings we saw of Rifat al-Arir and other intellectuals across the Gaza Strip, people who are teachers, who are sort of noble figures, are being targeted at home. And this is Dr. Hani al-Haytham, one of many people, prominent people in Gaza, who was murdered this week by Israel and who saved many lives, delivered many babies, and is gone, killed at home with his entire family. But Aaron, there was kind of an interesting intervention by mainstream media on these attacks on medical facilities in Gaza. The Washington Post published an investigation declaring what we have been saying, and others who were staring reality in the face, that the Israelis were simply lying about a Hamas command and control center being below this hospital.
Yeah, here it is. This is from the Washington Post. And of course, they use the most neutered language possible. They say the evidence presented by the Israeli government falls short of showing that Hamas had been using Al-Shifa Hospital as a command and control center, a Post analysis shows. And they base this analysis on the fact that Israel claimed that they had evidence that 5 hospital buildings at the Al-Shifa complex were being used by Hamas. Actually, there's no evidence of that, and these buildings didn't even connect to the tunnels that were underneath. But of course, this was obvious from the start, and these Israeli claims should never have been taken seriously to begin with.
Yeah,
that's the problem with investigations like this. It's better than nothing, but Israel's been caught lying so many times that the default whenever Israel says anything should be that they're lying, unless it can be corroborated with overwhelming amounts of evidence, which of course can never be produced because they're lying. And so this is, of course, after the damage is done. Israel put out these claims. They were aided by the Biden administration, including White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby. This is what he said to Chris Hayes back when this lie was being propagated.
Seen, and I think you just went through before the commercial break talking about how they have made public their findings in the hospital. I can't speak to specific intelligence other than to say that based on our own intelligence assessment, on our own collection and analysis of what we've seen, we believe that it isn't true. It is true that a command and control node was underneath that hospital, and that Hamas has used that hospital not only for storage of weapons, but also to house some of their fighters. So we have no doubt in our mind, just from our own intelligence analysis, that Hamas was using that hospital. And that's out of their playbook. This is what they do. They find ways to headquarter themselves in civilian infrastructure, digging tunnels under homes, placing innocent civilians in the crossfire between them and the IDF.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, obviously, sometimes intelligence could be wrong. I mean, notably, I remember covering, of course, the strike after the brutal suicide bombing outside the Bagram, outside the Kabul air base, in which someone who the U.S. intelligence believed was an ISIS fighter was actually just an innocent civilian happened. It does seem important, I think, just for global public opinion, particularly, that people do get furnished some sort of tangible proof. I mean, independent of whether the U.S. government believes it, the Israeli government, there is quite a bit of global public attention being paid to this conflict, and particularly the plight of the folks that were in that hospital.
Look how long-winded Chris Hayes has to be just to ask for evidence. You can just say, what is your evidence for that claim? Instead, he has to go with like this long disclaimer about how, it's possible that sometimes U.S. intelligence gets it wrong. He has to basically apologize for asking the most basic journalistic question possible.
Yeah, and it's important for global public opinion. In other words, it's important for U.S. soft power. It's not important for like people in Gaza not to be massacred and deprived of healthcare while they're being massacred. By the way, I love how Chris Hayes finally came out and called for a ceasefire after 20,000 dead, and Bernie kind of did the same thing. It's like the Social Democrat limit was 20,000 dead civilians before they could develop a conscience. And up until that point, they're like, we need Israel to get there. We came up with this arbitrary figure of 20,000 dead because we're Social Democrats. And now they've done it. Now we have the moral cover we need. And it's too late. I mean, it's worthless. Like, you already laid the groundwork. You helped consolidate the narrative. It's there and it's rolling. And John Kirby's just going with it day after day. And he's getting praised in Israeli media for, quote, making the case for Israel. I think that's the way the Times of Israel put it. The Ron Burgundy of the Biden administration, John Kirby. But the Shifa Hospital is barely limping along. I mean, people are in northern Gaza are deprived of everything. They're starving to death. Disease is spreading. Haaretz even published a piece only in Hebrew about how disease was going to spread from there into Israel and create possible plagues because no one was there. There was no ability to treat it. The Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital has been evacuated. People have allegedly been massacred outside it. All this happened, and MSNBC went into the tunnel with the Israeli military, this supposed tunnel they uncovered under Shifa Hospital, filmed it and claimed it as evidence that Israel was right all along. Now, why was it that Israel needed heavy equipment in order to dig this tunnel out? Were Hamas operatives going in and out every day with bulldozers from the hospital into this tunnel? Why did they only find inside the tunnel a bathroom and a reinforced door? And then when they opened the reinforced door, why was it like Geraldo when he went into Al Capone's vault and found nothing? There was nothing behind the door. Then what did they do? They blew up the tunnel because there was nothing. They didn't want anyone else to see that there was nothing there. It wasn't even apparently connected to the so-called Gaza Metro of tunnels that run up and down the Gaza Strip. It was close enough, easy enough for them to reach so that it could have been, it wasn't obviously reinforced against Israeli bombing. And there was no clear command and control center found anywhere near it. It wasn't even connected to the hospital. No. So basically they lied.
Yep.
And, it was interesting, Aaron, to see Louisa Lovelock's name on that Washington Post article, because her name was on every Syria propaganda piece. She just came out of nowhere and started pushing all of the Syria chemical weapons, regime change, white helmets propaganda. And she was writing press releases for the CIA and State Department day after day. And so it seems like there's a faction within U.S. intelligence or within the State Department that's not happy about what's going on. The New York Times now has a visual investigation today about how Israel's using bunker buster bombs and just killing tons of civilians, like duh. And that seems to reflect the same thing, that these elements within U.S. intelligence have activated their media assets to expose what Israel's doing on a limited level, but it's too late. And they don't have control. The political factions within the Biden administration have control. And they're fully on board with what Israel's doing.
Yeah, I mean, John Kirby talked about this is out of Hamas's playbook. This whole fake story about Al-Shifa was out of the U.S.-Israeli playbook. For example, saying things like this. This is a headline from the Wall Street Journal that was laundered on the day of Israel's assault on Al-Shifa, the day it began. U.S. relied on intercepts in assessing Hamas's operations at Gaza hospitals. The claim here is that the U.S. independently picked up intercepts of Hamas operatives at Al-Shifa. And if you read the article, of course, they declined to provide any evidence whatsoever, declined what the supposed intercepts entailed, what they discussed. And that's because they're just tapping here the old playbook that they used in Iraq WMDs. Remember Colin Powell talking about they picked up communications between Iraqi operatives discussing how to move their chemical weapons. Same thing in Syria, too, in the chemical weapons allegations against Syria. They've claimed they picked up intercepts of Syrian officials. Of course, these intercepts are never released because they're fake, or the intercepts don't say what the U.S. says that they say. So this is the same playbook here, just applying it to Hamas inside Gaza. And what did this do? All of this stenography set the stage, laid the groundwork for Israel to cross a line that no one else has crossed, at least in modern history, which is systemically attacking hospitals in such
Not
a
just
short period
bombing
of
them, Russia gets accused of that, or Syria's, they get accused of that. It's, what happened in Mariupol is very much in dispute. We're not going to go into it, but we're talking about sending soldiers into the hospitals, clearing out the hospitals, leaving babies removed from incubators in the ICU,
cutting off electricity, cutting off the power, so that at least in Shifa, at least 4 premature babies died, at least, because the electricity was cut off. Unprecedented. And then moving on to attacking other hospitals too. That's what they set the stage for, because Israel's goal is to exterminate as many people as possible and also destroy the basic foundations you need for a functioning society, which is a hospital. I mean, that's the only thing here. And the Biden administration put its rubber stamp on that, and they were aided by media stenographers. Another one, of course, is Jake Tapper, who published, and Jake Tapper, doesn't publish that many articles, but he really wanted to get this claim out about a Hamas command node under Al-Shifa Hospital, U.S. official says, and that one was by our friend Jake Tapper, who, as far as I've seen, has yet to issue a correction to respond to this new post investigation showing that his claims were yet another Israeli-U.S. fabrication.
Jake Tapper is not, he's politically and ethnically invested in this Holocaust. Jake Tapper is ethnically invested in seeing a Holocaust of Palestinians because he sees it as the only way to preserve Israel's exclusivist, quote unquote, Jewish character. He is a Jewish supremacist operating at the top of CNN, controlling their coverage. And there's just no doubt about that. It needs to be said, because no Muslim or Arab anchor could get away with what he's doing. And he hasn't faced any accountability for the many lies he's told. He's lied and lied again and again about Ukraine, about Syria, about all these other regime change wars he supports. But here, on an emotional and ethnic basis, he supports a Holocaust and has faced no professional accountability. And, this is just, we're not showing you what's really happening in this Holocaust, because we get demonetized. For every time I cough, I get demonetized now. It is so grisly. It is so horrible. It is so heartrending what's taking place, that I can't put it into words, and I can't show you here, but let me show you just part of a original short documentary we put up with exclusive footage from inside Gaza about one particularly heartbreaking incident at Nasser Hospital, which is in Khan Yunis. The battle has moved to Khan Yunis because so much of the population was pushed there. Israel's not able to completely level the entire city like they've done to Gaza City, just because everyone's packed in there. So they're carrying out a terrorist bombing campaign, and they hit Nasser Hospital with a tank shell on December 17th. This is just, I'll show you just the first few minutes, because it's important to learn about the victim of that attack. Her name was Dunya Abu Mohsen. This was the scene inside Nasser Hospital in Gaza's Khan Yunis on December 17th. As Israel's invading military forces closed in on the city, a tank fired a shell into the outer wall of the hospital. the Israeli strike killed Dunya Abu Mohsen, a 13-year-old girl who had been left alone inside the hospital with her leg amputated just weeks after her parents and siblings were killed in an Israeli airstrike. This was Dunya days before her killing, explaining how she imagined moving forward with life after losing her legs, her parents, and her siblings.
I want a prosthetic leg. I want to be able to walk like other people so that I can move and go out and play with my siblings. I want to become a doctor, like those who treat us, so I can treat other children. I only want one thing, for the war to end.
The Grayzone spoke to a doctor on duty in Nasser Hospital just moments after Israel killed Dunya.
As you can see, this crime is ugly. Dunya Abu Muhsin's family has already had their house bombed. They have already lost dozens of family members. Yet Dunya had miraculously survived and fought on. Today, a tank shell was fired at the hospital and it hit Dunya directly in the head. Her brain matter splattered across the walls.
So there it is. 13-year-old Dunya Abu Mohsen, one of the lone survivors of her family, lost her parents, was orphaned, lost her siblings, lost her leg, and in her hospital bed, Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the Israeli military came and hunted her down with a tank shell fast-tracked by Tony Blinken's State Department, circumventing Congress, and blew her head off, destroyed her, snuffed her out. And they're doing it again and again and again. And the U.S. just went to the UN to pass a resolution to provide cover for more killings like that. And that's what that's what Jake Tapper's identity is about. That what else can be said?
You know, and on top of all this too, part of the reason for the holdup in the UN resolution this week was that the U.S. would not allow the passage of a UN resolution unless Israel was able to inspect every piece of aid going into Gaza, because the proposal was that the UN handle it, the UN cover inspection. But Israel was insisting that first, before any aid goes into Gaza from Rafah, from Egypt, it first has to go to Israel, get inspected there, and then come back to Egypt and then be allowed in, which of course was leading to serious delays of the already meager amounts of aid that Israel and the U.S. were allowing in. And the U.S. held to that line. And that was a part of the reason for the holdup too. So you have the U.S. providing the military support, all these so-called dumb bombs, all the tank shells, as you mentioned, Biden administration bypassing congressional oversight, which is a rare step to make. They cite some emergency threat to national security. That's how they can bypass congressional oversight, providing the diplomatic cover by vetoing measures, and even stalling the already meager amount of aid that they're letting go into Gaza. It's a concerted campaign to wage genocide, to make not only Gaza ethnically cleansed, but to make the society unlivable for anybody who is able to remain.
Here is the Israeli military blowing up 56 buildings in the neighborhood of Shujaiya, east of Gaza City. And listen closely. You can hear the troops cheering as an entire neighborhood goes up in smoke. The people of Israel live, he says. And you can hear them chanting, "May your village burn," which is a genocidal Israeli anthem that many of the religious nationalist soldiers sing.
Max, maybe you could talk for a second about the importance of Shujaiya. I believe that's where Refat al-Arir is from. I also know it's sort of known as it's one of the oldest areas of Gaza, and also has been a sort of a symbol of resistance. And so the fact you have the sight of these Israeli soldiers from a distance blowing it up, because when they go in, they face resistance. I'm wondering if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk more about Israel's military setbacks. later, but Shujaiya is an area east of Gaza City. I've visited it, seen it in all of its destroyed glory. Met families there still in their homes, which had been destroyed in 2014. They rebuilt, and it's all been destroyed again because this is really the bastion of armed resistance in Gaza. It's where some of the most intricate tunnel networks are, and they've tunneled into Israeli military bases from there. Israeli soldiers suffered the heaviest losses, the Golani Brigade in Shujaiya in 2014. And then they came back for revenge, and they lost over 40, maybe 50 soldiers, hundreds of injured. They lost the battalion commander of Battalion 13, Tomer Grinberg, who fought in 2014 and had vowed revenge. They lost him in an ambush in which 10 soldiers, all officers, were killed in Shujaiya this time. And the Golani Brigade has actually been pulled out because they've lost so many people. So that's why they did that. And you can hear the soldier saying that this is for people to see in Nahal Oz, which is a kibbutz on the other side of Shujaiya in the Israeli Gaza envelope, for them to see that we've blown it up. So we need to show them a giant explosion and show them that we've accomplished something. And this was sort of the final blow before the Golani Brigade pulled out, to kind of, they need to show some kind of military victory there. So that's what that was about. But they also done something even more sickening there, which is in Shujaiya, they celebrated Hanukkah through various displays. Here they blow up a number of Palestinian homes, one for each night of the so-called Festival of Lights, the Hanukkah holiday. I guess it was the fifth night. So they've erected a giant menorah in the middle of Shujaiya, a giant menorah where no one else has light. The Israeli military also fired one tank shell for each day of the Hanukkah holiday into homes in Gaza. There's video you can easily find of that. And I believe it was there that a soldier celebrated his daughter's birthday by blowing up a building, and that soldier was among those killed. So what you see here, I celebrated Hanukkah. It was kind of a different celebration. I wasn't massacring and destroying and conquering people when I did so. This is some kind of a satanic cult that's appropriated Judaism and Jewish symbols to advance a genocidal settler colonial project. And they wonder why anti-Semitism is spreading when they hold Jewish symbols up over people's heads that they're killing. And this is why Jewish anti-Zionists are so passionate about struggling against this monstrous project. This is what they're doing openly, proudly. And at the same time, anyone who maybe has never met a Jew and doesn't have Jews in their society, and is unable to distinguish between Judaism and Zionism, maybe a Palestinian who has only experienced Judaism through these characters, these ogres showing up to destroy them, humiliate them, and kill them, then they justify their genocidal wrath on the basis of that perceived anti-Semitism. It's a perfect little dynamic they've created.
I remember going to Gaza. I've only been there once. It was more than 20 years ago. It was 2002, summer 2002, during the Second Intifada. And I remember listening to kids talk about what the Jews do to them, and shooting at them, harassing them, arresting them. I mean, all the horrible experiences that they've had. And I, when I first heard the term, Jew, like the way they spoke, I was like, oh, like, why are they speaking to them like that? But of course, if an army comes occupying you, harassing you, murdering you, arresting you, they call themselves the state of the Jews. Of course, you're going to call them Jews. I had to have that moment of sort of like dissonance to fully grasp what what a Jewish person looks like to people in this besieged ghetto, including kids.
Yeah, I mean, and I would sometimes meet older men in Gaza who had actually worked inside Israel, who had Jewish Israeli friends who spoke Hebrew, and you talk to them, and it's a total contrast between them and the generation that's grown up after the siege, that's known nothing but these massive military assaults and had no mobility, no social mobility, and no geographic mobility, no ability to leave. This is one of the first times they've actually encountered Israeli soldiers up close and personal for many young people in Gaza, because they tend to just operate through aircraft, just bombing them from far away. And speaking of up close and personal confrontations, as Israel lacks real distinguishable military victories to be able to broadcast back to the Jewish Israeli public, they're manufacturing images of them in order to satisfy the bloodlust that was unleashed after the October 7th attacks on Israeli communities and military bases by Hamas. And here's what they've done. I'm sure most people watching this have seen images like this of hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian men, mostly in the northern refugee camps like Jabalia, being rounded up from UN schools, from their homes, humiliated, taken shirtless on trucks. It turns out that they've been taken to a kind of concentration camp south of the Israeli town of Beersheba. Beersheba is like the big city in the Negev desert, so it's close enough to Gaza, but it's a fairly major city. And a military base has been transformed into sort of a torture and processing center for these men, where they've been subjected to beatings. They're forced to sleep all night with bright lights on. And according to Euromed Human Rights Monitor and Haaretz, several of them have been killed. And the Israeli army itself was asked how many of these men had any links to Hamas, meaning, were they members of Hamas, the same way like, some of my neighbors might be members of the Democratic Party. They said only 10 to 15% were. Most were, barbers, blue collar workers, shop owners, teachers, journalists. Some journalists have been identified among them. And so those are the victories, the quote unquote victories, because if you actually follow Israeli influencers on social media, or just go to the For You function on Elon Musk's Twitter X instead of your followers function, where you follow people you follow, you're going to get tons and tons of Israeli influencers or pro-Israel influencers in your feed who are claiming these are all Hamas battalions, that Hamas is being conquered. And this is the way the Israeli public is seeing it too. They're seeing this as a giant victory, when in fact it's a substitute for a victory that's completely elusive. Let me show you kind of psychologically why this is happening. Okay, I don't know if I can't show it now, but Aaron, you remember the genocidal anthem with children singing for the annihilation of everyone in Gaza, right?
Yes.
Broadcast on Israeli public TV, or they're on the national broadcaster. It's sort of like NPR or something. And YouTube has removed the video of it that Electronic Intifada first translated, so I can't show it here. But it was produced by this guy named Ofer Rosenbaum, who's a public relations agent and nationalist propagandist based in Tel Aviv, who's known for his provocative messaging. And he started out in October with a billboard campaign, with a billboard that read "Never Again." Look, this is an image of it. Let me try to get it closer in. Never again, referring to the Holocaust, and vowing vengeance against the architects of October 7th, as well as Hezbollah. And what you see there are Israeli soldiers representing different branches of the Israeli military and security forces, standing above prominent figures associated with regional opponents of Israel. There's Hassan Nasrallah, Khaled Mishal from Hamas, Abu Ubaida, the spokesman of Hamas. And they're doing to them what you just saw Israeli soldiers doing in Jabalia. This was what Israel was psychologically prepared for after October 7th, and they never got it. They didn't get it. There have been no significant Hamas figures who have been taken out or hauled out of their home. Yahya Sinwar, the prime minister of Gaza that everyone hates, who oversaw the October 7th operation. They haven't found him. They've gone to his houses and blown them up. You think he's going to be sitting in his recliner chair waiting for them? No. And so the Israeli public starved for a psychological victory that they've been prepared for. And so instead, they just are taking it out on average civilians. And meanwhile, the military continues to lose men. Channel 13, Israel's Channel 13 reported today that 25% of all injuries incurred in the Gaza Strip to Israeli forces would have been deaths just several years ago and are now severe, very severe injuries where the soldiers are sort of on the verge of death. They've counted something like 140 deaths inside the Gaza Strip, which is high for a small society like Israel.
And if we're talking about October 7th now, we have to also update everybody. You might have missed this because it didn't get any attention in the U.S., but now the Israeli official toll civilians killed is now less than half of what Israel initially claimed. Remember, the initial figure for October 7th from Israel was 1,400 civilians. Then it became 1,200. And now the latest I saw is they revised that 1,200 figure down to 695.
Well, let's be a little careful with that. The 1,400 and 1,200 always included the 350 to 400 active duty military who were killed.
Okay, so, yes, but if you okay, fine. I'm sorry. So if you listen to how, for example, Chris Coons spoke to me on the train, he said 1,400 civilians. You know? So the figure that was put out, that then got conflated with the civilian toll. So it's true. Yes, the official toll always included Israeli forces, but the way apologists for Israel spoke about it, they then conflated it and they took the whole number of 1,400 to mean civilians. But now, anyway, it's down to 695 civilians, which was less than what Israel initially claimed.
And how many of those did Israel itself kill?
Yeah.
We saw the Israeli military kill 3 of its own hostages inside the Gaza Strip in Shujaiya. They took off their shirts, waved a white flag, were screaming in Hebrew to the soldiers, and a sniper shot 2 of them. The other ran away, and they sent soldiers on foot to hunt him down and kill him execution style. These were Israelis. And the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, went and pleaded with one of their mothers. And she said, I forgive you for everything. And, if you need any help from me, let me know. If you need any reinforcements, I stand with you all. And now they're making her into the hero because the dominant mentality in Israel right now is sadomasochism. They're sadistic towards the Palestinians and they're masochistic towards their own military, which just keeps killing them. And they don't seem to care. They killed at least droves of them on October 7th using heavy weapons in indiscriminate fashion. And now for the first time, we have video from inside Kibbutz Be'eri, where over 100 people were killed, from Israel's Channel 12, showing Israeli tanks firing on Israeli homes. What I see in Be'eri is smoke in the northern area. This is the report that aired on the 10th of December. For the first time since October 7th, we get the chance to see Be'eri's catastrophe from above, the same way the citizens and security forces did at the time. While the neighborhoods were burning at 4:20 p.m., here's a helicopter. I'm watching from above, Be'eri to the north. I see smoke in the north. Are there burnt houses there? Yes, yes. And now you see an Israeli tank in that red circle. A tank was aiding the forces at the house of Hesi and targeted the house. There's the tank. Suddenly they brought a tank. I said to a soldier, "Did you shell the house? Would the hostages get hurt?" He said, "We're only targeting the side walls of the houses to demolish them." This makes the work of the army and special forces look stranger because every house had 15 hostages inside. He's saying, "Oh my God, they're shelling," the helicopter pilot, "they're shelling houses." Suddenly a strong explosion sound and I can't move my leg, said a survivor. A tank hit here. It was completely clear to me. I was hit and I had shrapnel from the tank. So these are the few survivors, but we know that, for example, the 12-year-old twins in Kibbutz Be'eri, Lael Hetzroni and her brother were killed by a tank shell along with 13 others in a home, deliberately shelled. They knew Israelis were in there, and they had orders to shell it.
So somehow if you target a side wall of a house with a tank shell, that magically is not going to kill any civilians trapped inside. I mean, that does not make any sense at all. But of course, just as Israel, of course, has no regard for civilian life in Gaza, it shows here they had no regard for their own civilians too, because they were employing most likely the Hannibal Directive, which says you can kill your own in these situations.
Total lack of regard for human life among the Israeli leadership and much of Jewish Israeli society. Anything that gets in the way of military objectives must be eliminated and liquidated. And on October 7th, it was masses of Israeli civilians, plus the civilians, the captives, presented the opportunity for a politically painful exchange for Palestinian captives, Palestinian political prisoners in jails, which the Israeli leadership really, really does not want to do.
Yeah.
And so it would kind of make sense that they would eliminate them on the way to Gaza. And you've had freed abductees actually complaining to Netanyahu's face and to the war cabinet in private meetings, as reported by Israeli media, that you were attacking us with Apache helicopters on our way into Gaza. Then you have this 47-minute video, the video that genius communicator Chris Cuomo was recently treated to, along with the deep thinking philosopher Dr. Phil also was treated to a viewing of the secret 47-minute tape off the record viewing that Israel is delivering to popular influencers, celebrities, journalists in a kind of Clockwork Orange style fashion. This shows many people, as Chris Cuomo described, who had been melted into furniture or cars and who had been charred to the point that they were beyond recognition. How does that happen with the small arms that Hamas brought in? Did they have some kind of super weapon? No, this is just Hellfire missiles and tank shells.
Yep.
And so Chris Cuomo actually saw people killed by the Israeli military and then came out and called for another Afghan and Iraq war. He said, what Israel's doing is like our response to 9/11, which was brilliantly conceived and completely moral. He actually said that. And he's a great judge of morality, having helped his brother write talking points about sexual harassment allegations while serving as a supposed journalist for CNN.
Like, even without knowing all the basic facts about October 7th, as you covered at the Grayzone, as Electronic Intifada has, Mondo Weiss has, people like Chris Cuomo, they don't use basic logic like you just did. Like, how is it possible that Hamas's weaponry could cause the explosions that we saw, these destroyed homes? Like, they don't have tanks. They don't have rocket launchers, like all the things you would need to do that. They don't apply the most basic logic. Same thing with the allegations of mass rape. Same thing with all the claims about Al-Shifa Hospital. Even if they remain completely ignorant of the facts, there's never even any minimal logic applied. And it's important to point out, when we talk about what happened on October 7th, what Israel's doing is not revenge for the fact that Israelis were killed by Hamas on October 7th. This is revenge because Israel was, as an occupying power, was humiliated. Israel's deterrence capability, as it's by its own definition, from the start of its existence, has always relied on what is called fear in our enemies. So Ariel Sharon in 1967 said that we're losing our main deterrence capability, which is the fear of us. That's what Sharon said. And Naftali Bennett, after October 7th, he wrote something similar. He said that basically, quote, Israel's future depends not on pity from the world, but on fear in the hearts of our enemies. So to be an occupier, to sustain the occupation, you have to have fear in your enemies. And because that fear was shattered on October 7th, when the people of Gaza fought back with the operation, you have to restore that fear. And that's what Israel is now doing in the most brutal, genocidal way possible, just destroying the entire population, the entire Gaza Strip, to sow fear.
Yeah, it's also to restore the lost masculinity of the Israeli population, the sense that they are superior men to the Palestinians, that they settled the land, that they are these these Ubermensch pioneers. And that's part of what the Hamas mass rape narrative feeds into. It's intended to fuel the desire to restore the masculinity lost on October 7th. And it's also what those displays of shirtless Palestinian men blindfolded, forced to sit on the ground in cold mud is designed to do, to show that we are the Ubermensch. And, Israeli women serve in the military too. And I've seen them personally humiliate old men in the West Bank, old male farmers, women who came over from Poland and Russia, humiliating some guy who's been living off his land for generations and generations, tending sheep. There's a component there of psychological domination that they lost on October 7th. Many Israeli female soldiers were killed as well, who were enforcing the siege. And these aren't, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, let me show one quote. Again, this is just to show how historic this is and how this has always guided Israel. This is from the New York Times in 2008, when Israel was carrying out another massacre in Gaza. And this is by the Times top correspondent in Israel at the time, Ethan Bronner. And he wrote that this is 2008. Israel has a larger concern. It worries that its enemies are less afraid of it than they once were or should be. Israeli leaders are calculating that a display of power could fix that. So basically, the people of Gaza are sacrificial for an Israeli display of power. And a display of power means massacres. And only by committing massacres of the people of Gaza could Israel restore the fear in the hearts of its enemies. I mean, that's what all of this is about. And it's not just now, it's what Israel has always done, going back to its founding.
Ethan Bronner, who had a son in the Israeli military while he was a correspondent for the New York Times. And the New York Times, after October 7th, reported that Israel needed to restore, or wrote that Israel needed to restore its aura of power.
Yeah.
I think you noted that as well.
Yeah.
So that is one of their goals, but it's not a real military objective. It doesn't free the hostages, for example.
No.
It doesn't end Hamas as a political entity, which is one of the stated objectives the U.S. has also laid out. And it's becoming more clear, especially since Israel killed 3 of its own hostages in direct execution style, the way they've been killing so many Palestinian civilians waving white flags, execution style, in the streets of Gaza, is that bringing the hostages home and destroying Hamas are mutually exclusive. And the Bibyists want to simply destroy Hamas, and it's they're openly saying that they don't really care about bringing the hostages home. Just let them die there.
Yeah.
They have old men from the founding generation who are captives, and they're saying, don't let us grow old here. We helped found the country. You can't abandon us. And they're willing to do that in order to continue this genocidal assault for many of the reasons that we just outlined, including restoring the aura of power.
Yeah.
But there are others in the Israeli establishment, including the so-called Thomas Friedman of Israel. His name is Nahum Barnea. He's this longtime columnist for Yediot Aharonot, Ynet, mainstream Israeli publication, who's come out and written a column saying there's no military solution to the hostages. We have to end this at a painful price and negotiate. Ehud Olmert, who was the author of the second assault on Lebanon, the second invasion of Lebanon, which failed miserably, as well as brutal assaults on the Gaza Strip, he has written a column for Haaretz saying the same thing. And here is Martin Indyk, who is a longtime U.S. peace processor, himself a stalwart Zionist, who said today is a turning point in Israel when leading journalists, Barnea Bergman, referring to Ronan Bergman, who also writes for the New York Times, security columnist, sort of a voice for the gatekeepers of the security establishment, and Ben Caspit, tell the Israeli public, Caspit writes for Ma'ariv, I believe, tells the Israeli public what Netanyahu will not tell them, that Hamas is bruised but will not be defeated, and the best that can be done now is to negotiate a return of the hostages at a high price.
You know, Max, I have to notice here, just looking at that, Martin Indyk follows you on Twitter, but you don't follow him back. You should maybe give him the courtesy of,
Right,
you
here
know,
we go.
of a follow back.
All right,
maybe
Marty.
maybe you can
I'll
interview
DM
him
him.
one day. Yeah, you can interview him. He is he's one of these characters who cut their teeth pretending to oversee a peace process while really acting as Israel's lawyer, as Aaron David Miller, one of his colleagues, put it. But he can see the writing on the wall there, and obviously he doesn't care about Palestinians, but he must see Netanyahu's leadership as disastrous for Israel and U.S. interests, and that's why I presume he's now critical of Netanyahu. I haven't followed Indyk very much in recent years, but the fact that he's willing to admit that, I think, speaks to some panic that the establishment in the U.S. knows that Hamas can't be defeated, and that what Netanyahu is doing ultimately will undermine U.S. and Israeli dominance in that region.
Yeah, I mean, Indyk represents the old liberal centrist Zionist camp from within the U.S., although he's actually from Australia. He said he made Aliyah to the U.S. to basically get involved in the peace process and make sure it went in Israel's direction.
Yeah.
And you have elements in the Biden administration that are trying to unravel Netanyahu as well, because they think he's just a loose cannon, too extreme. And as soon as there's a ceasefire, that's the end of Netanyahu. He's toast. He could go to jail. Not for the reasons that he should go to jail, but he could go to jail for corruption. But that's not going to cut it. The U.S. is not going to be able to engineer a ceasefire by orchestrating some New York Times visual investigations and saying mean things about Netanyahu. It's going to have to suspend the weapons. It's going to have to threaten Israel with concrete measures. And so far, it's what we see from Blinken and Biden is they're Israel's lawyer.
Yeah.
But on the ground, the dynamics are not working in Israel's favor, in my opinion. And you can do an anecdotal analysis by just following the videos that the Al-Qassam and Al-Quds brigades put out on a daily basis, showing them killing Israeli soldiers in the field. They're continuing to operate. They're operating in a very free-form structure where you have guys in Adidas track pants who go out in teams of 2 or 3 with Yasin 105 tandem anti-tank rockets and small arms, Kalashnikovs. And sometimes they'll have a Cornet anti-tank weapon or a sniper rifle, but they're basically working with the basics of guerrilla warfare, and they're taking out tanks. They're taking out soldiers. They killed 10 officers, including a brigade commander in Shujaiya, in about an hour. And the Golani Brigade has been forced to withdraw temporarily because it's lost so many people. And this is, I think this is shifting the political dynamics. And a lot of things could happen from here. First of all, it is creating more pressure for a ceasefire. But at the same time, there's a counter pressure from Netanyahu and the forces around him to show, and in the war cabinet, to show they're not going to be defeated in the field. They're going to keep killing and keep killing. They're just killers. And then you have the Northern Front, where something like 80,000 people in northern Israel are gone. Maybe 100,000 are gone. They're not able to live in their homes, which are close enough to Lebanon for Hezbollah to strike. And Hezbollah forces are south of the Litani River. So Israel is demanding that Hezbollah return. This is Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel. He's demanding that Hezbollah return to its positions north of the Litani River, which is like 20 kilometers from the border, maybe a little more. He's claiming that there was a UN resolution after 2006, which requires them to be there, but Hezbollah never signed that. And I don't even know if the Lebanese government did. And if they don't do it, he says that he will attack. And this could be a perfect way for Netanyahu to stay in power and for them to keep this war going and also answer this crisis they have where the borders of Israel have actually been temporarily shifted in the north without having to resolve the problem in Gaza, where they can't seem to defeat Hamas or get the hostages out. And there appears to be, it appears more likely by the day that Israel will initiate or a war with Hezbollah by escalating in the north. And that could lead to regional warfare, dragging in forces all across the region, as we see the U.S. initiating this Prosperity Guardian fake coalition to protect Israeli-linked shipping going through Bab el-Mandeb through past Yemen. So Israel, what I'm saying here is Israel's failures to meet its military objectives in Gaza could lead to a wider war rather than a ceasefire.
It's so funny to hear Israel insisting on the implementation of a UN resolution in Lebanon. What about UN Resolution 194, the return of Palestinian refugees, UN Resolution 242, Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories? Israel never cares about those resolutions. And whenever they talk about UN resolutions as they apply to Hezbollah or some other official enemy, they always ignore the part of the resolution that applies to them. So it's always a selectively applied demand, binding only on Israel's enemies, not on itself.
Yep. And it's a joke, the whole UN. No one's paying attention to the UN system here. But then, I mean, Operation Prosperity Guardian is a complete joke too. Are these actually international territorial waters? Yemen's own sovereignty was violated ruthlessly by the Saudi military and the coalition with the UAE and Qatar, with the US providing all the weapons, the US and the UK providing all the weapons and logistics they needed for years. Yemen was the worst humanitarian crisis. They lost hundreds of thousands in this assault and starvation siege where they were attacking the port of Hodeidah. And now they are the de facto government, and they're stepping up for the Palestinians. They're one of the few Arab countries stepping up for Gaza. And so the US has to come in and crush them. Lloyd Austin goes to the region, claims to come up with this great, powerful coalition to escort shipping. And all it is the same old, it's basically the status quo. Spain, Italy, these increasingly impoverished European countries, which are probably being bribed by the US, they're not contributing anything. They're not even contributing a rowboat. They're just saying, okay. And it seems like Spain is actually subsequently pulled out. No Arab countries would join except the smallest country in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain, which is simply a parking lot for the Fifth Fleet of the US Navy, has no other value to the United States. So there's no Arab partner in Prosperity Guardian. And then you have the powerful regional player of Seychelles, which exists thousands and thousands of miles away.
Since you mentioned Bahrain, Bahrain's joining the U.S. in this. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. helped Saudi Arabia put down an uprising in Bahrain back in 2011 during the Arab Spring. As the U.S. was claiming it supported freedom movements in Syria, for example. When there were protests in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia sent over forces. The U.S. backed them up to put down the uprising because they wanted to keep a client state there and keep the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet there. So this is now one of the dividends of that decision, is they get Bahrain's cooperation with this effort in Yemen.
Yeah, and that was one of the most brutal. The repression in Bahrain was more brutal than anything to date at that point in 2011, 2012, when we saw them crush the rebellion. So it looks like we're in for a long war, thanks to the United States, thanks to Biden. I think we should just have one little look at how Biden's messaging on the war. This is pretty funny and revealing and sad. It's always funny and sad when you're listening to Biden talk. And here's Biden on the tarmac being asked about a possible ceasefire deal right before the UN vote.
Are we expecting a hostage deal anytime soon? Yes. Oh, really? Okay.
Well, and then you can hear the reporter, oh, really? A hostage deal? Great. You know, when I first watched this clip, I said, great. Yes, it's going to end.
Well, where?
Where? Wait, where else could it be, Biden? What other hostage deal do you think he's talking about?
Oh, no, I'm talking about. You're talking about the.
Are you? We're
pushing it.
We're pushing it.
There's no expectation at this point, but we are pushing it.
And your reaction to 20,000 dead in Gaza, that death toll reached today, today?
It's tragic.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. 20,000.
It's tragic, and he walks.
Here we go. Watch him.
Today.
It's tragic.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Just walks away. It's just completely dismissive of 20,000 dead on his watch. Thanks.
He's not even with it enough to pretend as if he cares. Like Donald Trump, he would try to pretend about this kind of stuff as if he cares. He would, like when he pretended to hear the news about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he pretended to care. I mean, Biden can't even be bothered to pretend to care about the murder of 20,000 people with his support. He can muster 2 words and he just walks away. That's all he can do. He has to hide from the media now whenever he gets some question approaching reality.
Yeah. He got much more excited. I mean, we played some clips from it. But he was much more voluble at the White House Hanukkah celebration where he talked about his father.
This year's Hanukkah is different. It's been 65 years since the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. 65 years. After October 7th, my father returned to his kibbutz to salvage what he could from his home. What was left was the rubble and ruin.
So his father was actually a survivor of Hamas attacks on October 7th, and he returned to his kibbutz to salvage whatever he could from his home. My understanding was Biden's father has been dead for 20 years, but
I mean, at the same event, he also said that line about how Jews would not be safe, including in the U.S., if not for Israel. And he also doubled down or tripled down on his claim that he had seen photographs of beheaded babies, which has already been admitted to be a lie. But he is so out of it that he can't remember that he's already been caught lying 2 previous times. He repeated that, I believe, for what was the 3rd time. He just can't stop spreading that lie.
Yeah. I mean, Biden is operating on the same principles that Tony Blinken is operating on. And I guess Benjamin Netanyahu, which is that, number one, Jewish Israeli life matters more than the lives of Palestinians. And number 2, Palestinians must accept a life of permanent control under Jewish Israelis, permanent occupation, and get whatever crumbs they can off the master's table. And anything they do to resist that must be punished harshly, because they are threatening the lives of people who are superior to them. That's the way the entire U.S. response to October 7th and everything that came after, that's what it's based on. And that's what made October 7th inevitable, that Palestinians, and when I say Palestinians, I mean all Palestinians, not Hamas, had no diplomatic channel, had no recourse, and no right to actually struggle for their independence as American patriots did in 1776 with weapons, or otherwise with rocks, as they did during the Great March of Return. They had no right. And so they were on their own, and they should just do it and not care what the rest of the world, or at least the collective West, thinks. And you hear that kind of that Tony Blinken's recent remarks at the State Department were shot through with that kind of supremacist psychology.
One of the things that's striking to me is that, understandably,
I don't know why there are two Tony
Everyone would
Blinkens
like to see this
talking.
conflict end as quickly as possible. But if it ends with Hamas remaining in place and having the capacity and the stated intent to repeat October 7th again and again and again, that's not in the interest of Israel. It's not in the interest of the region. It's not in the interest of the world. And what is striking to me is that even as, again, we hear many countries urging the end to this conflict, which we would all like to see, I hear virtually no one saying, demanding of Hamas that it stop hiding behind civilians, that it lay down its arms, that it surrender. This is over tomorrow if Hamas does that. This would have been over a month ago.
That's terror logic. So basically, Blinken's saying Israel has the right to slaughter as many Palestinians as it wants until the resistance fighters who happen to live amidst among them, they don't hide among them, but they live there because they're all trapped in the same concentration camp, unless Hamas lays down its arms. That's straight up terrorist logic. It's saying we're going to terrorize your civilians until your resistance fighters lay down their arms. It's straight up state terrorism.
Yeah. And why is it that the occupied, the oppressed, the impoverished, the ghettoized have to put down their arms? Why is it? Why does no one ever call on Israel to put down its arms? Yeah, of course it would be over. It would be over, and then they would go back to being permanently occupied, and Israel would continue to take their land, and you would continue to support it because you went to the Middle East and you went to Israel, Tony Blinken, as a Jew. That's not me talking. That's you talking. You went as a Jewish supremacist who favors Jewish Israelis over Palestinians because you identify with them on an ethno-religious basis because you are a racist. That is the essence of racism, of ethnocentrism, ethno-supremacism. I don't run around calling people racist. I don't like to. It can be a cheap insult, but that's what we're dealing with here. Absolutely. This is real institutional racism.
Yeah.
I mean, and if anyone, by the way, like Michael Richards, Kramer, when he got on stage and said the N-word because he was being heckled by some black people, you know, he went on Dave Letterman and cried openly. And Jerry Seinfeld came on and pleaded with America to forgive Michael Richards. And Michael Richards then went away and disappeared. He never got a show. He has like some book out about the sad clown he is. And Jerry Seinfeld again and again went to Israel to show his support for this apartheid state and is there now to support a straight up Holocaust. Jerry Seinfeld isn't going to be coming back having to cry on national TV for supporting the industrial slaughter of children. Jerry Seinfeld's going to come back and still be famous. If anything, Michael Richards should try to convince us to accept. In a sane society, we should have to convince us to accept Jerry Seinfeld again. But we don't live in a sane society. We live in a society that elevates people like Tony Blinken to be able to tell the Palestinians to put down their weapons while they're being slaughtered. They were slaughtered in 2014. They were slaughtered in 2018. They were slaughtered in 2021.
Let's hear just a little bit more of Tony Blinken because he doubles down on this, and we have to hear what he says here. It's just extraordinary.
6 weeks ago, if Hamas had done that, and how could it be? How can it be that there are no demands made of the aggressor, and only demands made of the victim?
So,
who's he talking about?
So the aggressor is Hamas. Right, the aggressor, and the victim is Israel. As Israel is massacring more than 20,000 people, destroying homes, hospitals, mosques, schools, creating well over 1 million refugees, blocking aid, helping to spread disease. Israel is somehow the victim here, and Hamas is the aggressor. And look, even if you were to pretend that history began on October 7th, and forget that Hamas, that the fighters that attacked Israel on October 7th were doing so from inside the world's largest concentration camp, which is under the world's longest military occupation. Even if you forget all that, what Blinken's saying is still a lie, because October 7th was one day. And that doesn't give Israel the right to then launch a more than 2-month-long genocide campaign attacking civilians. It's just like, you can't say that Hamas is the aggressor because of a one-day attack. Israel is now carrying out this unprecedented mass murder campaign. And Blinken is up there saying that somehow Israel is the victim. I mean, the guy needs to be studied psychologically. You can tell that when he talks, he's not comfortable speaking because there's something going on inside him that knows he's a fraud. But he goes up there and still says it. And at least in Biden's defense, he's cognitively declining. I mean, Blinken understands what he's doing, but still goes ahead with it. He's an unbelievable character whose job title is diplomat. I mean, he's the biggest warmonger in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and he delivered all these remarks at the end of the year State Department press conference, which I stupidly skipped, about our shared common humanity. Lines that could have been lifted from some kind of Jerry Lee Lewis telethon while he's presiding over the genocide of our time.
Yeah.
He does. It's a whole cognitive dissonance there. Like and then they put it on Twitter like he isn't going to be relentlessly ratioed.
By the way, back to genocide, Jerry Seinfeld. His own show was actually very prescient on who Jerry really is. Watch this.
Jerry's a Nazi. Jerry's a Nazi. Jerry's a Nazi.
That's him posing with Douglas Murray. I mean, what Douglas Murray has said and written is worse than about Black people and immigrants is worse than anything extremely damaged Michael Richards said on stage, or it's on the same level. And Michael Richards wasn't exactly calling for policy proposals towards those groups. And they're all the worst people are gathered in Israel right now. Jared and Ivanka, and they all get taken to Kibbutz Berry. It's like been turned into a museum of genocide justification. I mean, soon people are going to have to pay entrance fees to go there. They're never going to let anyone come back. And none of them ask any questions about why those houses were just reduced to rubble, how that happened. But back to Blinken and back to diplomacy. This hostage deal is very interesting in closing to watch, because Hamas is offering terms that really chart out a path forward for Palestinians, not just Hamas, that the U.S. and Israel are determined to block, because they're calling for the release of 3 of the most popular non-Hamas resistance figures, leaders of factions that are not Hamas, from Israeli prisons who've been just jailed indefinitely to prevent them from challenging the Palestinian Authority of the deeply unpopular vassal Mahmoud Abbas. We're talking about Ahmed Sadat of the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and I'm drawing a blank. And Marwan Barghouti, formerly of Tanzim, who was jailed during the Second Intifada, and Mohammed Barghouti. And they've started this new kind of coalition party to bring in all the forces that are outside Fatah that really represent, I think, where people are at across Palestine. His popularity has grown enormously since October 7th. Palestinians are yearning for him to come back. He's someone who has said that he's for a 2-state solution. He's always said that. Israel put him on
nonviolence. Yeah. Also for nonviolent resistance. So it's like he's such a contrast to the image we have of Hamas, the image pushed by Israel in the U.S. He's a secular leader. He calls for nonviolent resistance. He says he supports a 2-state solution, and Hamas is calling for his release. And they're calling for it because he's one of the most, as you say, one of the most popular political figures inside Palestine. We're talking about Marwan Barghouti, if there's any confusion there. And so yeah, that does put a lot of pressure on Israel and the U.S. And I don't think they'll allow it, because they just cannot allow somebody who actually represents the will of, I don't know how many Palestinians, but certainly a sizable portion of Palestinians would support him if there were elections.
It would mean the end of the Palestinian Authority if they were let out.
Yeah.
It would mean pressure for democratic elections that would bring forward figures who would be capable of actually creating the political pressure necessary for Palestinian sovereignty, with Hamas willing to step aside. I don't think they want to govern. I think they understood that after October 7th, they would not be able to govern anymore. But they've tried so many times to step back and do coalition deals with the Palestinian Authority, and Israel and the US will never let them do it. They will not allow democracy. So what we're talking about is a regime change plan in which the US will not allow any Palestinian figure with any credibility to have any power within this future dystopia that they're mapping out. That's Tony Blinken's form of diplomacy. It's just diplomacy as cover for sheer fascistic domination.
Yeah. And the language that Jake Sullivan is using, genocide Jake Sullivan, when he talks about having a revamped Palestinian Authority. So basically what they mean is another collaborator, but just not Mahmoud Abbas, who's now, he's in his late 80s. He's outlived his use. Now, he was supposed to step down more than a decade ago.
Revamped.
So it's now a revamped Palestinian Authority. So basically a revamped collaborationist Palestinian force. That's what Jake Sullivan means.
At a certain point, Israel's going to be forced to take direct control of Gaza and the West Bank, as long as you have Israel's lawyer in charge in Washington, whether it's, the liberal lawyers or the Trumpian lawyers like David Friedman, who openly say that the Trumpians are more honest. They're willing to take the mask off. They're calling for full annexation of the West Bank. Okay, do it.
It's a de facto annexation anyway, so it makes sense to make it official, because I've heard Norman Finkelstein point this out, that even to call it an occupation at this point doesn't do it justice, because Israel controls everything. So it's not just an occupation. They've just full on stolen it. They've stolen the West Bank. They control everything. They steal everything they want. So an annexation formally would just make it official, what is already reality anyway.
On that point, someone asked an interesting question. What do the two blue stripes on the Israeli flag mean? And to me and many people who live in the region see them as representative of the original Jewish National Fund charter, which saw Israel's borders as anywhere between the Nile and Jordan River. So on one side, you have one stripe, which is the Jordan River to the east, and you have to the west, the Nile River. And Israel's tried to go all the way. And then in the middle, you have a Jewish star. They basically just hijacked a faith symbol of our community, and they made the flag blue and white to make it look like the tefillin, the sort of holy cloth that you wear as you go to synagogue, all to sort of tap into Jewish support internationally. So that's my interpretation, and I think it's a correct interpretation of the flag. And we're hearing soldiers going into Gaza declaring that Gaza is ours. We're going to bring back the settlements, and then we're going to go and take Lebanon. And Israel has attempted to take Lebanon, at least up into the Litani River, because they need the water supply there. So Israeli expansionism is a real thing, deeply embedded in Zionism.
Oh yeah. Like you go back and you read what their planning was. They talked about establishing a Jewish national home because they wanted to hide the fact their goal was a state, and not just a state in whatever the UN partition plan would be in all of that land. David Ben-Gurion wrote about that. We'll accept UN's partition for now, but we define the true borders of Israel, and that's exactly what they did through ethnic cleansing and conquest.
Someone actually said not the Euphrates River. I meant the Euphrates River, not the River Jordan. So Euphrates, Cairo. That was the Jewish National Fund charter, I think 1913.
Wow.
We got like 10 or 8 minutes. I'm going on Judge Napolitano at like 5:05. So if you can't get enough of me here, check me out there. But I don't know if you want to do any Ukraine.
Well, what is there to say? The Ukraine war is a disaster. Washington is sort of in a bind. because they know it's lost, but yet Biden doesn't want to admit that because that would be horrible for his reelection. And of course, they just want to deny Russia a victory at all costs. So right now, the current debate in Washington is whether or not Biden will get another $60 billion to prolong the proxy war. And Republicans are trying to get Biden to agree to all these harsh border militarization measures. And it looks like Biden's going to give it to them. And honestly, the progressives who helped Biden get to this point, they made this moment possible. So if Biden sells them out and makes a deal with Republicans on the border, I think the first people to blame are the progressives who stood with Biden to support his neocon proxy war and put him in this position where he now needs Republican help to extend it with another $60 billion. And that's the current debate. There was some talk recently about the U.S. putting pressure on Ukraine to negotiate, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that at all. Other recent developments include Ukraine's top negotiator who was in Turkey back when Ukraine and Russia reached a peace deal in April 2022. He recently acknowledged exactly what was reported at the time, but ignored in the U.S., which is that Boris Johnson came over, told Zelensky, if you sign a peace deal with Russia, we're not going to back you up. And that was in order to keep fighting. He also said that all Russia wanted, basically, was that Ukraine declare its neutrality. That's what Russia mainly wanted. But that was not possible for Ukraine's ultra-nationalists and their neocon allies in Washington. And so the war has continued to this point with, I don't know how many people being sacrificed, but the funniest part of, I think, Zelensky's visit to Washington recently was just as Zelensky arrives there to beg for more money, to sell the case for more money, the U.S. puts out this declassified intelligence report claiming this: Russia has lost almost 90% of its pre-war army, U.S. intelligence says. So just as Zelensky's begging for more money, this is obviously put out to try to convince Republicans that, look, we're getting our money's worth because look at all these Russians who we've killed. But the problem is they don't pause to think, does this line up with our other talking points, which is the other one is, if we don't stop Russia now, then they're going to conquer other parts of Europe. So which one is it? Has Russia lost almost all of its army? Or is Russia so powerful that after Ukraine, they're going to move on to the rest of Europe? Like, you can't have both. You got to pick one lie, but they can't because they're throwing anything at the wall that sticks. Like the whole thing about democracy versus autocracy, that didn't work. Now the Biden administration is talking about how much money all these states are getting that from the military-industrial complex spending on this war. They're just doing anything they can to try to keep this war going until at least November 2024.
And it looks like Russia's going on an offensive of its own.
Putin's talked about taking more regions, including Odessa, and I think it's a safe bet that they will do that, if not, anytime soon, certainly sometime in 2024, the way things have been going, because again, Ukraine was pushed into a counteroffensive, even though the U.S. privately knew, as we know from leaks, that Ukraine didn't have the capacity. They didn't have air power. They didn't have the proper training. They didn't have the proper equipment. And they don't have the manpower. And that's why we're now seeing stories in the New York Times and elsewhere about how dire it is on the front lines and how people are being kidnapped, essentially being sent off to war in Ukraine.
And that would mean regime change. It would mean, if Odessa's taken and the ports and the sea are cut off, it would bring Zelensky's rule to an end. The humiliation would be too extreme. Kiev would be taken. He would have to move back. I mean, there's the possibility that Ukraine would just simply be a rump state with its capital in Lviv or Lvov, whatever you want to call it. And then the U.S. would support it as a kind of Taiwan sort of Taiwan sort of neighborhood anti-Russian porcupine, which might be what they do even if Kiev remains intact and limps along. You're seeing the war of the Mandarins deepen in Ukraine. Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, who was one of the sort of three principals brought in after the Maidan coup by the U.S., is going after Zelensky, accusing him of being anti-democratic. And when you say stuff like that, you're basically appealing to the West. You're appealing to the EU and the US for support, as though you're going to run in the next election against Zelensky.
Yeah. If you remember Klitschko, if you go back to that tape of Victoria Nuland from early 2024 when she early 2014 when she's plotting with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who should run Ukraine after the coup. They mentioned Klitsch, but then Nuland says Klitsch is better off on the outside. We don't want him. And the reason was Klitsch was too close to the Europeans. And Nuland also said, fuck the EU. So they didn't want Klitsch on the inside. But now Klitsch is making a new appeal to Ukraine's real leaders, which are in Washington. And speaking of which, when Zelensky came to town recently, first people he met with, or among the first people he met with, were military industrial complex executives. And this is from the Wall Street Journal. At their meeting, Zelensky asked for their advice ahead of his meeting with Biden. So that is totally makes sense because these are the real constituents for this war, the war profiteers. So understandably, Zelensky is asking them for their advice before he goes off to meet with Joe Biden.
Well, this is a massive, humiliating defeat for NATO, for Biden, and I think it will carry into the war that the U.S. has gotten itself involved in the Middle East, where I don't think things will play out in Israel's favor in the long term, although Israel has firepower on its side in a way Ukraine did not. I'm going to have to get ready to go onto Judging Freedom with Judge Andrew Napolitano in like 8 minutes. So check me out there. But thanks for being a part of this. And definitely subscribe if you haven't already done so. Like this stream. We're always getting demonetized, so that helps us kind of beat the algorithm. And support us any way you can. We're bringing you original documentary reports from inside the Gaza Strip. We're doing everything we can to tell the other side of the story and to break the media blockade. So thanks again for all your support. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we go.
Stay tuned for my book on Ukraine, on the Ukraine proxy war, coming out early next year. I'll have more details on that soon. And
all right.
Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Please like the stream, as Max said. And yeah, thank you.
Nice. Mazel tov, Aaron. Good one. I can't wait. We're going to do some Grayzone events maybe at the OR book space in New York, maybe beyond.
Yeah, well, maybe the one venue in New York that will let us talk. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see you on Terry Gross on NPR and at the Austin Festival of Books.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Peace, everybody.
Peace, everybody.